Welcome back from spring break and the beaches of Cancun. Today's lecture is about the creation of a new social democratic system in the aftermath of the Second World War, primarily by the Labour government that was elected in 1945. But as you've all been sunning yourselves in Cancun, I'm going to just begin by giving you a brief resume of where the class, what the class has been trying to do and where this next series of lectures fit in. So the big narrative arc of the class that I've been trying to drum home to you over the last couple of months is about what I have described as the rise, fall and reinvention of liberalism. So we looked at the way in which liberalism emerged out of a critique of the ancient regime in the 18th and early 19th century. We spent a good deal of time looking at the forms of liberalism in the 19th century and its persistence into the 20th century. And today we're going to look at its displacement by a new system of political and economic management that became known as social democracy. Now, when I grew up, not being four in 1997 like some of you, in the 1970s, this system was still very much in place and still seemed very secure. It was a system that in many ways had grown out of the wreckage, not just of the Second World War, but out of the experience of the political and economic chaos of the 1920s and the 1930s. And it had been remarkably successful. It had delivered unparalleled prosperity to the British people, unparalleled levels of employment, of health, of education, and of housing. And it had done so through a new approach to government that had made planning and the management by technocratic experts absolutely central to the way in which the state and government work. So central that it even extended to economic life and to the management of economic relations. Indeed, the economy was entirely restructured. That is to say, that key parts of the economy were taken into public ownership. This is a radical departure from the idea of free market economics that had become so associated with liberalism in the 19th century. And the idea was to take the key sectors of the economy into public ownership, to be owned and run by the state, in order to make sure that the economy and the market bent to the will of the people and delivered key areas of social improvement. Now, even though when I grew up the system seemed very secure, it subsequently came to a rather rapid end. And so in the next few lectures, I'm going to be basically talking to you about what I describe as the brief life of social democracy. Okay, this is how it is that social democracy was constructed and how it operated from the 1940s, and then how it begins to be dismantled and displaced by something that we now understand as neoliberalism from the 1980s. To be able to explain the rapidity of that collapse from the 1980s, I think that we have to try and take seriously as historians the achievements of social democracy, what it was that social democracy did well, but we also have to understand its inadequacies. We have to understand why it became so vulnerable to criticisms and to new political directions in the 1970s and the 1980s, why it became so vulnerable to a new type of politics at that time. And so that's basically what I'm going to be trying to do in the next few lectures. Okay, so enough of the general fitting this into where it fits in the class, now onto the lecture itself. I want to begin by reminding you that the Second World War was not as culturally traumatic for the British people as the First World War had been. And I talked about that last time we met, primarily in terms of the reduced levels of mortality. There had been over 1 million casualties in the First World War, British and colonial soldiers. There were basically a quarter of those in the Second World War. But the Second World War, I'm going to suggest to you today, was politically far more transformative than the First World War had been. Now, as we saw in the last lecture, there's a big debate that rages amongst historians about how transformative, how politically transformative the Second World War had been, how radicalised the British people had been, and how much they embraced the Labour Party manifesto of Let Us Face the Future and the new model of social democracy it promised. But while it may be true that the British people may have been hesitant about embracing this new system and this new call to face the future by the Labour Party, it's certainly evident that the British people did not want a return to the chaos of the 1920s and the 30s, or the same retreat from the political promises that had been held out to them after the First World War, of a new social contract and houses fit for heroes and all of that stuff. In many ways, I think that the unemployment and the hunger marches of the 1920s and the 1930s became a symbol of that lost generation and of the lost promises after the First World War, of the wasted human capital, of the suffering and the inequality that had characterised those decades. It was this that the British people never wanted to face again. Now, if the English Revolution that George Orwell had so wanted to happen in 1941, 1942 arrived, it came not as Orwell hoped as a democratic revolution, I'm going to suggest, but it came as a technocratic revolution. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, what I'm going to be arguing to you today is that the wholesale restructuring of the British economy and society in the decades following the Second World War was wrapped up in a language of modernisation and sometimes even the cultural forms of modernism. In many ways, what this meant was that there was a growing prestige, and indeed dominance, some would say, of the idea that particular groups of experts knew more than the British people and were held responsible for the reconstruction of post-war society. In this sense, I think that while it may be the case that the British people had trust that those experts would reconstruct society in ways that were fair for all members of the population, they didn't necessarily ever have a democratic mandate. Those experts weren't being driven by a popular mobilisation or a demotic will. In many ways, the work was simply delegated to them. In this sense, I think that you can think of this process as not dissimilar to the forms of intervention upon society that we saw happening by experts promising a new science of government in the 19th century. when I talked about the way in which liberalism created this new domain called the social, where you would have people like Chadwick designing new systems of sanitation or of workhouses to work upon people that were considered to be not yet proper liberal subjects. So in some sense, what we can see here is a continuation of a belief in the science of government and the role of experts in reshaping society. The key difference here, the really, really important difference, is that those 19th century interventions were about particular groups of people, those who were seen to be inadequate in some respect, whether they were poor, whether they were unsanitary, whether they were ignorant, etc., etc. The interventions that come after the Second World War are interventions made in the name of society as a whole, of society as one large community. Nonetheless, what I'm going to be suggesting to you is that there is a long ideological shadow of liberalism that remains evident in the reconstruction of British society after the Second World War. And in many ways, the very best indication of that, or the very best illustration of it, is the Beveridge Report of 1942 that we talked about last time. Here you have a new model of universal social insurance that would cover everybody, would provide them forms of welfare from the cradle to the grave, and yet it was presented as an attack upon ignorance, squalor, idleness, disease, and want. This is a very Victorian liberal set of terms. In many ways, you see that there is some of the same sense of condescension towards people who were thought to be ignorant, squalid, idle, or unhealthy. The other thing I'm going to try and suggest to you today is that if this long trail of liberalism is still evident, there were also material limits to the construction of social democracy as much as ideological ones. In many ways, the conditions of emergence of social democracy couldn't have been worse. You couldn't have imagined a worse set of circumstances. Britain was effectively bankrupt, having fought 2 world wars in the space of 20 years. And the state of financial ill health that Britain found itself on had, as we'll see, real consequences for the attempt to develop a new social democratic infrastructure of houses and schools and hospitals. In this sense, I'm going to say to you that social democracy in Britain, in a way, seemed to be housed in a very Victorian framework, both ideologically but also materially. As you'll see, many of the schools and the hospitals actually took place in old Victorian buildings. And I think this is profoundly significant. Okay, so let me move on to talk about how it is that social democracy was constructed after the war. And I'm going to talk to you about it in the 4 categories that were so important to the Beveridge Report, in the idea of employment, of education, of housing, and of health. Now, the big question that we have to face today is whether that Victorian framing of the Beveridge Report in terms of idleness, want, squalor, ignorance, and disease was transformed into a more positive recognition of employment, of poverty, of education, of health, and of housing. These were the counterparts of all of those terms. Okay? How far then does the Labour Party and the Labour Party's manifesto and the Labour Party's policies in the years after the war, how far did it transform those into a more positive conception of social rights? And what I'm going to try and do is show the way in which they try and do that in each of these areas, but I'm also going to try and highlight some of the limitations that were evident in that process. So let's look first at the idea of employment, of how idleness is transformed into a discussion of employment, and not just employment, but full employment. 1944 was a very important year here. You'll remember that the plans for post-war construction had basically been feverishly discussed and debated since 1942. And the idea of employment and the state's responsibility for securing employment for its people was one of the key areas of that discussion. In 1944, William Beveridge, this hyperactive man, publishes a key document called Full Employment in a Free Society. Full Employment in a Free Society. And there are 2 important things about this document. One is that it defines full employment as achieving employment for 97% of the population, i.e. it recognised that there would be still around 3% of unemployment. The other key innovation of this was that it placed responsibility on the state to deliver full employment by the means of Keynesian demand management. And so this is an enormous transformation from the 1920s and the 1930s, where so many people had been unemployed and the state took no responsibility really for their employment, apart from a very few number of limited works in the so-called distressed areas. 1944 was also the year where the government published its white paper on employment, which basically took up Beveridge's arguments. Now, in some ways, this seems like a radical proposal in the context of the 1920s and the 1930s, and yet it was very much in the air generally. It was hugely influential across the Dominion. So in Australia, they get a Full Employment Act in 1945 that looks almost identical to the government white paper in Britain. Even the United States of America has its own Full Employment Act in 1946. Okay? So this is something that is not unique to Britain in any sense, but we need to just pause to remember that if the 1920s and the 1930s had been characterized by anything, it was by the normalization, rather like we have now, that somewhere between 10 to 15% of the population are going to be unemployed. We now routinely think that 10% unemployment is bad, but it's tolerable. That's more or less the figure that we have now. Here we have a context in which governments across the world are pledging themselves to say, no, full employment is an absolute necessity to the legitimacy of the government. Full employment in Britain, i.e. an unemployment rate of under 3%, was achieved in 1948 and lasted until 1970. So over 2 decades of so-called full employment. So how was this achieved? It was importantly achieved by the state taking a central role in the management of economic life. And the first element of that was the idea of the mixed economy, this hybrid combination of private and public ownership. And public ownership was achieved through a program of nationalisation, the nationalisation of certain key sectors of the economy. In 1946, you can see at the bottom of this slide the Bank of England and the coal industry were nationalised. Remember how symbolically important the coal industry had been since the late 19th century, and certainly between in the 1920s when the general strike came out of the conflicts in the coal sector. Air, road and rail were nationalised in 1947, gas and electricity in 1948, and then iron and steel in 1951. By then, 2 million workers, 10% of the workforce, were employed in this new public sector. That gave the state an unbelievable amount of control over economic life. But that wasn't all, because the state was also a huge employer in other respects too. Most importantly, the new welfare services that the state was creating, which we'll learn about in a minute, meant that by 1945 there were 400,000 workers in the new welfare state, and that grows by about 200,000 by the early 1950s. It's also the case that the British arms industry continued to be hugely important. So it wasn't just the fact that the government was employing the new teachers and nurses and social workers. They were also had an important role in terms of industrial and technical civil services. There was something like 423,000 workers in the defence industries by the middle of the 1950s. So these three very key areas that gave the state a very strong control over forms of employment and therefore rates of wages and many other things as well, which we'll come to in a later lecture. Yeah. Sure. Got it? Now, this is all the more remarkable because, as I said at the beginning, Britain was in a type of financial state of emergency in 1945. You see here a graph of the level of national debt that had been growing, that had been steadily cut by cheap government in the 19th century, raised dramatically in the era of the First World War, and peaked in 1945. So, despite this calamitous financial position, again, not that dissimilar to the one that the world faced in 2007, this new system of social democracy was constructed upon a perilous financial position. So the austerity measures that we have experienced over the last 5 years have not been a necessary consequence of financial crisis. And this is a good example of why not. In 1945, Britain had £22 billion worth of war debt. There was a debt of something like £2,000 per capita. National debt was 238% of GDP by 1947. It had been just 125% in 1939. So the cost of the war had been prohibitive, but then so too was the cost of reconstruction after the war, and in many ways that was made possible by US loans. £145 million were borrowed from the American government, and there was a line of credit for a further £930 million, which was to be paid back over 50 years at a rate of 2%. Indeed, the last loans paid off to the American government came in 2006. Now, I'm not trying to suggest to you that everything was rosy in the garden despite these financial conditions. There was a widespread perception of austerity that was primarily associated with the continuation of rationing. So rationing, as we saw, was an essential component of Britain's management of the war, and many of the key forms of rationing continued deep into the 1950s. Many foods continued to be rationed until 1954. Clothing, coal and furniture even continued to be rationed down to 1958 and becomes a politically very contentious thing, as we'll see in the next lecture. So rationing clearly was one of the key ways in which people felt and experienced austerity. Another key limit to the achievement of full employment was the failure to democratise the workplace, which had been a key ambition of the incoming Labour government. In 1947, joint production committees, JPCs, had been introduced by the government. The idea was to try and facilitate a dialogue, a constructive and creative dialogue between workers and their employers, and to bring workers in to the management of industries. And this was led in the public sector. It was hugely unsuccessful outside of the public sector, where, of course, private employers were hugely antagonistic to this initiative. And indeed, many people in the public sector saw this as a very limited and, in a way, a rhetorical push rather than something of any real purpose. Another key limit that I want to emphasise about the delivery of full employment was its gendered nature. And I have to do a little bit of backtracking here to be able to explain that to you. Full employment was something that, of course, applied to men and to women equally. But the employment market was increasingly conceived as a male domain. And we can see this also in the design of the new forms of social insurance and welfare benefits. And in many ways, this ran counter to the actual trend. So there had been a rise of the number of married women that were in the workforce. In 1931, there had been just 10% of married women workers. By 1951, there were double that number. In fact, there were 22%. But